Hi there, my name's Paul and I'm a lecturer in psychology at the University of East London. For a long time now I've been interested in how we can use psychology to help students learn more effectively. And that's going to be the focus of this particular presentation. I'm going to show you how some key research in psychology can help you go about your studies more effectively. And I'm going to do that by focusing on a topic called metacognition. And I'm going to show you how we can all be susceptible to certain what we call metacognitive errors that can really make our lives more difficult than they need to be when we're studying. Of course, I'll also tell you what you can do about these metacognitive errors and give you some general advice on how you can study more effectively. Just a bit of housekeeping. I'm probably not going to shoot this video in one go, so if you see any glaring errors in continuity, it's because I shot the video over several sessions. And also, as you can probably tell, I'm not reading from a script, nor do I have a PowerPoint presentation per se. I've just got a laptop somewhere off in the distance that I'll have to stare at occasionally to remind myself of what I should be talking about. So, without further ado, let's get on to the topic of metacognition. What is it and why is it important?
Wile E. Coyote, super genius. I like the way that rolls out. Wile E. Coyote, super genius.
So we've just seen a video in which the long-suffering Wile E. Coyote was confidently proclaiming his genius, only for the real world to catch up with him in rather spectacular fashion. Now, something similar can happen when you're studying. Well, hopefully it won't involve a shack of TNT and an oncoming train, but it might, for example, involve, let's say, a topic that you think you know a lot about, and you certainly feel that you know enough about this topic to ace an exam that's coming up in the not too distant future. Well, what happens if you get to that exam and suddenly you open the first page and then you realise your confidence in your knowledge was completely misplaced and you don't know nearly enough to do well? Well, that's what we would call a metacognitive error. And like a lot of things, metacognition is easiest to define when it goes wrong. A metacognition is really about how you come to an understanding of how learning works, or how you think about the process of thinking. And I know that sounds really esoteric, but hopefully, just with the example we've just shown, it's really, really important for your academic progress to have an accurate idea of how you can learn effectively. And equally, it's important for you to have an accurate idea of how much you know and how much you don't know, because this kind of knowledge is what shapes your studying behaviour. And accordingly, metacognition is often broken down into two subcomponents. There's metacognitive knowledge, which is what you know about the process of learning and what you know about, well, how much you know or how much you don't know. And there's also metacognitive regulation, which is how you use your metacognitive knowledge. I mean, we all know, for example, it's easy enough to know that something is good practice. The difficult thing is often actually acting on that knowledge and implementing the good practice. So let's have a look at some examples of some problems that can occur with metacognition. And let's start with a problem that can occur with metacognitive knowledge. And it's a particularly nasty problem called the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Will you shut up?
Wait a minute, that word you keep calling me?
Ignoramus?
Ignoramus? It means I'm stupid, doesn't it?
There's a difference between ignorance and stupidity.
Not to me there isn't, you
Homer?
ignoramus.
You're the ignoramus.
Homer.
No, you are.
Homer, would you like to present your rebuttal?
With pleasure.
Ay, caramba!
So I've got a question for you. Have you ever heard the expression ignorance is bliss? If so, have you ever really thought what that's referring to? Well, if you watch any of the TV shows like Come Dine With Me, for example, what's the funniest part of that show? I'm willing to place a fairly substantial bet you just said it's the narrator. Well, think about why the narrator is funny. More often than not, the typical funny scenario occurs when a contestant is happily kind of murdering the preparation of a particular meal but seems completely oblivious to the fact that the preparation is going hideously wrong, And the narrator kind of serves as the voice that should be going off in their head saying, no, you're really screwing this up. You really need to think about what you're doing. Now, ignorance is bliss, as it turns out, has, if you like, a psychological counterpart. And that counterpart is called the Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect basically refers to a finding from a series of studies back at the turn of the century that's been replicated many times since, which basically tells us that it is when we are the least competent or least knowledgeable that we are the most liable to having an inflated perception about our competence or our level of knowledge. And if you want an example of a kind of experiment you can set up to demonstrate the Dunning-Kruger effect, consider the following scenario. Let's say you approach a class of new undergraduate students and you say, okay, you guys and girls, there's going to be a test at the end of this course. And what we're going to ask for you to do is predict how well you think you're going to do on this test. So of course the test comes around, the students complete the test, and then you say to them, okay, what we're going to do now is we're going to compare what score you thought you'd get to the score you actually got. And what you find in experiments like this, it's the students that do the most poorly on the test that exhibit the biggest discrepancies between how they thought they would do and how they would actually do. And how they actually do is always significantly lower than how they thought they would do. Hence, ignorance is bliss. Now, the way that you avoid this problem when you're studying is you kind of make a resolution to yourself that you won't rely on your intuition when it comes to making judgments about how much you know about a particular topic. Rather, a much better way of assessing your knowledge on the topic is to do what psychologists refer to as retrieval practice. And this can be as simple as just reading part of a chapter, for example, putting that book or whatever source you're using to one side, and then trying to recall a small part of that in your own words. And of course, if you can do that, then that's evidence that your subjective impression about your level of knowledge has some basis in the real world. If you can't do that, well, that's your cue that you need to hit the books again. Now, having reviewed one significant source of error when it comes to metacognitive knowledge, let's move on and have a look at another metacognitive error that concerns metacognitive regulation.
Or, with our help, you can cram like you've never crammed before.
Whatever, either way is good.
So I'm going to invite you to do a thought experiment with me. What I'd like you to do is think of what study practices you would write down if I asked you to make a note of the study practices you use most regularly. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if this list contains something like, I reread my sources repeatedly as a go-to study strategy. Equally, I wouldn't be surprised if the list didn't contain something like I test myself on my knowledge frequently, or retrieval practice as we call it in psychology. And the research that's been done on student study habits points to a metacognitive regulation error. And that error is that students that use effective methods of studying are actually the exception, not the rule. Now, if you were to audit your studying behaviour against the table that I'm going to put on the screen, what I'd invite you to do is look at exactly how many of the different studying practices are highlighted in that table as red and being of low utility, which means their use isn't supported by the psychological literature. And if the response to looking at that table is, blimey, a lot of the things I do to study have been identified as low utility, then you need to start thinking about changing the way that you approach studying, because at the moment you won't be getting the best out of your efforts. Now, I think the reason and the take-home message from this particular failing in metacognitive regulation is that it's very easy to conflate things that seem easy and straightforward to implement with things that are effective. i.e. the temptation is to think, well, rereading something repeatedly is really easy to do, therefore it must be an effective way to learn. But actually, more often, learning works much more like going to the gym, i.e. you've got to sweat a bit for it to work for you. So, if you're using study strategies that, make you question your knowledge, make you respond to feedback, make you think about the material more in depth, then you're much more likely to get more out of your efforts to study, even though it will probably feel a bit worse when you're doing it. So, having looked at that particular metacognitive regulation error, let's move on to the next part of the video, where we'll consider some more errors that people make when they're studying and how you can overcome those errors.